The numbers suggest Giannis might be having his best season ever in the NBA, but yet we're unsure whether he is the favorite for the MVP. There's a lot of other players getting a ton of attention, but ultimately, if you're a Bucks fan, is it just the title that you care about in the overall legacy? We're talking Giannis today. We do it a lot, but we want to dive deep into what this season and the next couple of seasons could mean for Giannis in the big picture. Let's get started.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Bucks. My name's Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show Monday to Friday, and also find my work over at ESPN. And we have got not a first-time co-host, but the first time back in a little while, Dan Shafer, who many people will know from the Recombobulation Area Substack newsletter that everyone should be subscribing to. But he also does Milwaukee Bucks writing as well. And he's got a recent story over at Milwaukee Record that we need to discuss. And that is specifically why we are getting into the Giannis conversation today. But today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. That's BetOnline, where the game starts. And before we bring Dan in, I have to thank you all for making Locked On Bucks your first listen or first watch of every single weekday and occasionally on the weekends. Whether it's the old school podcast platform or on YouTube, which we love, we appreciate it. And I have to keep plugging the YouTube stuff because we're doing live pods now. You can jump in the stream. The comments are going off. There's arguments. There's debate. And there's also occasionally some nice comments towards myself and the other hosts on the show, which we also appreciate. But we've got to build an audience, and that's where the fun stuff is happening. So get on YouTube, subscribe, turn the notifications on, and you'll know when we're doing a show. But Dan, welcome back to Locked On Bucks, first of all. And did I get the Recombobulation Area plug right? Because that's the most important thing here.
You got it right, Kane. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. Good to talk to you as always. And yeah, the Recombobulation Area, we publish on Substack. Write a lot about news and politics and all the craziness happening around the state of Wisconsin. But, you know, as a palate cleanser to after the election here, I had to jump in and write something about my beloved Milwaukee Bucks.
Oh, we love that because I told you, you're a brave man for diving into the politics stuff day to day. I'll read your stuff, Dan, because I do have clearly a pretty high interest in what goes on in Milwaukee. I haven't been there it's hard to believe, but it's going to be coming up 3 years here in a couple of months, which is just absolutely ludicrous. But hopefully I'll be back before we get to the 3-month mark. But still a second home for me, so I love it. Before we get into the Giannis stuff, because you have got an article up, MilwaukeeRecord.com. Encourage people to check it out about the Giannis legacy stuff. And we're going to get into the Giannis legacy conversation today. I know the listeners of this show and the wider Bucks fan audience love that conversation. So I want to get into it. But I haven't spoke to you on this podcast for a long time. So the Bucks 18-6, they just dusted off another team yesterday with a win. They're about to go into Dallas. What's your read on the Bucks and where they're at this point in the season in a more broad conversation?
Yeah, I think you have to be happy with how the season has started so far, especially, you know, given that Middleton has not played most of the games up until this week here. So, you know, the Bucks have the second best record in the league. They're chugging along. They have the best player in the NBA. They're doing the thing that they have done pretty much every year since Mike Budenholzer has come to town. They're beating the bad teams. They're getting, you know, taking care of business, and they're, you know, playing some really fun, high intensity basketball when they're playing against the top teams in the league as well. So, you know, second best record in the league, out of the gates really well. And then I feel like they're just going to continue to build this team and get ready for, you know, another really fun postseason run.
Have you been to many games this year?
I have not been to a game yet this year. No, I've been so swamped with election coverage and all this. I have not been able to get down to a game, but definitely we'll be doing that pretty soon.
Yeah, it is. I tweeted about it last week, but you know, watching the Giannis on TV just doesn't quite do it justice in real life, in person. It's an extraordinary experience, which brings us to this article. As I said, MilwaukeeRecord.com. Make sure you check it out. So, Dan, can you just give us some background of why you wanted to write about this, and then just the general idea of this story centered around Giannis and legacy, really?
Yeah, I wanted to, really take a step back and look at the big picture of what was going on with this Bucks season and with Giannis and his career. And not only just big picture within the scope of this season and getting out of the day to day of one game after the next, but really looking at his place in NBA history and the team's place in NBA history. And I started thinking about, you know, this Bucks team, they didn't win back to back last year, right? It would have been a tall task for them to win back to back. Not a lot of teams do that. And but they have a chance with the team that they have this year, the team that they have put together, to win 2 in 3 years, which would be a pretty remarkable accomplishment, and not only vault the Bucks into kind of being the team of the 2020s, but would vault Giannis into another tier historically as one of the great players in NBA history as well. So one of the things that I did in this piece was kind of make the comparison between the Bucks and the San Antonio Spurs of the Tim Duncan era. I feel like that is probably the best historical recent history NBA comparison for the way that the Bucks are structured. They have the Giannis in kind of the Tim Duncan role as being the megastar, the guy who's really the fulcrum for everything that happens for this squad. And then he's flanked by two, terrific perimeter players who are kind of borderline all-stars in the regular season and guys who can really go up a level in the postseason. So I think Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday, you could kind of make the comparison with them and Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili. So it's kind of a similar structure with each of the big threes in those teams. So I feel like, the Spurs were a team that never won back to back, but they were able to, they won 3 titles in 5 years between 2003 and 2007. So I think the Bucks, are on a similar trajectory there. If they are able to, get back to the finals this year, win another finals this year, they become, a team that has some of those dynastic qualities that the Spurs did, instead of, maybe one of the one-off champions like Dallas in 2011 or the Detroit Pistons in 2004, or even the Toronto Raptors in 2019 or the Los Angeles Lakers in 2020. They would move kind of being from one of those one-off championship teams to being something that has larger significance within, the scope of NBA history. Winning 2 in 3 years is something that, doesn't happen quite as often. So I definitely, I don't know. I think that is probably the closest historical comparison, recent history NBA comparison, is the Bucks and those Spurs. And I think, the way I kind of characterized it in the piece is that the Bucks are the Spurs, but cool.
Yeah, I did like that line, and I guess that's the reference to Tim Duncan and Giannis, because as you make that comparison, so first of all, a lot of people would say you're talking about a top 10 player of all time, or top 15 of all time with Tim Duncan anyway. So you're not saying anything offensive, but there will be people that will come on. Giannis is more enjoyable to watch than Tim Duncan, whatever it may be. That's totally fine. But the other comparison is superstars that have been in one city for the entirety of their career, which right now is why the Dirk comparison is apt, because it was a little bit longer for Dirk in terms of the wait for the first title. But as it currently stands, you've got Dirk, who is forever going to be a legendary figure in Dallas because of what he was able to achieve there. The same is already to be said for Giannis, even though clearly the personal or the individual accolades for Giannis already dwarf that of Dirk. But you've got Dirk, you've got KG, who also won one title, a little bit different. But that's the type of bracket I guess we're talking at. If Giannis continues on this pace, clearly he's going to dwarf all those players, and that's where Tim comes into it, certainly with the championships as well. So you mentioned the word dynasty, and I want to dive into that a little bit more about what you think defines a dynasty, because clearly this is subjective and everyone feels a different way about it. And I referenced the way that Giannis plays the game of basketball, and there's no doubt about it that watching Giannis play basketball is an absolute masterclass, which brings us to our friends from Masterclass, which are sponsors of this podcast today. And with Masterclass, you can learn from the world's best artists, icons, and leaders anytime, anywhere, and at your own pace. You can learn how to do maybe a Euro step. If Giannis was on Masterclass, he would be teaching you how to Euro step. Maybe Tim Duncan would be teaching you how to shoot a little mid-range bank shot. But on Masterclass, you can learn how, the art of songwriting from John Legend. Mariah Carey can teach you how to use your voice as an instrument, or Chris Voss could teach you the art of negotiation. There's over 2,500 classes on Masterclass and 180 plus instructors. So I highly recommend you check it out. This holiday, give the perfect gift of an annual Masterclass membership and get one for free. Go to masterclass.com/lockedon today. That's masterclass.com/lockedon. And as usual, terms and conditions apply there. But don't forget about our friends over at LinkedIn Jobs as well, Dan. This is very important, particularly in these days. Lots of people are looking for jobs, but lots of people are looking to hire people. And these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have the access to the best qualified candidates available, and that's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in very handy. They have a bunch of different tools, like screening questions, I should say, so you can make it easy to focus on the candidates with the right skills and experience. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Dan, I'm exhausted. That was a solid back-to-back ad read. We don't have it a lot, but we certainly appreciate it. There's no doubt about that. Let's get back to the chat about Giannis, though. So let me ask you the simple question. What do you think qualifies a dynasty? And do you think the Spurs were a dynasty? They won the 3 in 5 years, and then they had a significant gap to the 4th title. But clearly, as we know, right throughout that period, they were a highly, highly competitive outfit.
Yeah, I think they do qualify as a dynasty, even though they never won back-to-back. But I think really just being a dominant team of an era. And I think that's kind of where the Bucks are headed right now, if they're able to win multiple championships too. Because if you look back to, if you go back to that season you mentioned, the first Giannis's first MVP season was kind of when their title window opened, right? So they have the 2 back-to-back best regular season records. And then they follow that up with the championship in 2021. Obviously didn't repeat last year, but had a terrific performance as well. And now this year are poised to be in the mix again. So I think if you're looking for a team kind of this era, I think the Bucks are going to, have a real chance to stand out as, perhaps the team of the early 2020s. And I think, obviously Giannis is the main part of that, right? And in just the same way that Tim Duncan was the main part of that for the San Antonio Spurs.
So I don't think, and first of all, I agree with your point in terms of teams that are consistently up there, whether, it was the Spurs, the 50-win seasons, whatever it was some silly number of seasons that they won 50-plus games. We know, as people that enjoyed watching the Milwaukee Bucks, you generally hated playing the San Antonio Spurs, even though there was some good moments along the way. For year after year after year, it was a brutal experience. So that deserves some credit, but we are in an era where if you don't win, nobody's giving you credit, and nobody's giving you credit for just making the finals or just making the conference finals. So just on the idea of dynasty, I think you need at least 3 in a pretty short period of time. So like the Spurs, 3 in 5 years. Are you there? If the Bucks win 2, are you on the dynasty train, or does that have to be 3?
I think you're right. I think it does have to be 3 in a short period of time. But I think winning 2 kind of puts you in a tier where it's maybe not quite the dynasty that you saw with the Spurs or recently with the Golden State Warriors, but you're in the tier with like the Kobe Pau Gasol Lakers or even like the Wade and LeBron Heat teams, or a number of these teams that kind of either won back-to-back or won 2 in 3 years. It's a different level from just winning that one-off title. And I think that is really the history that the Bucks are chasing this year.
So that's interesting as well. So with the Lakers, for example, so you mentioned the Kobe and Pau team, but clearly Kobe was there throughout, and he was also a part of the Kobe Shaq stuff. So there's franchises that can win multiple titles over periods, and Miami kind of did the same thing. They obviously had the 2 with LeBron, but then D-Wade was a part of the one prior to that. So I think that's something that the Spurs do have going for them, is that it was the same trio for the latter 4, and then obviously they had one earlier as well. So that would be interesting for this Bucks team, which does bring into another part of your conversation when it came to the idea that there is somewhat of a clock on this iteration of the Bucks with Middleton and Lopez, and we're not suggesting that they won't be on the team next year or the following season, but there's decisions to be made.
Yeah, Brook Lopez is in the last. We're not talking about it that often, but Brook Lopez is in the last year of his contract. He's having just an absolutely incredible season, maybe his best year as a Buck. Just probably the front runner for Defensive Player of the Year. I've been hearing him on a couple podcasts, talking about maybe some All-Star buzz as the Bucks' second All-Star this season. I think that's a pretty interesting possibility for Brook Lopez. But he's 34 and he's had a significant back injury in his career. You don't know how long this type of run is going to last for him. Drew Holiday and Chris Middleton are both older than 30 at this point too. I expect that their games will age pretty well, all things considered, but you never know. And, with Giannis, just turning 28, he's still in the heart of his prime. I imagine that prime will be a long one, knowing who Giannis is. But you never know how many opportunities, how many different cracks at it this team will potentially get. So I do feel like there is a little bit of urgency with this particular season. It's a very, veteran laden roster. They have, these role players who are getting a little bit older. They don't have what they don't have that the Spurs did have, especially in the back half of their run, is a player like Kawhi Leonard, who could extend the primes of a lot of those players. So it's certainly a different dynamic, and I think there is some urgency with the Bucks title window being open this year that it might not be the same way in future years.
Well, there are some Marjon Beauchamp stands who are incredibly offended by you saying that the Bucks don't have a Kawhi Leonard on their roster. I've seen that comparison come up in the YouTube comments more than a couple of times. I think this year there should be a sense of urgency. And we saw last year, things can change pretty easily with one injury. So part of watching this team, you enjoy it for what it is. You're so happy that they got one in the bank already because no one will ever be able to take that away. But you do get a little thirsty for more. You get a bit hungry for more. And when I look at the NBA this year, Dan, I see Boston, who are quite clearly a really, really damn good team. But I also think that the Bucks and the Celtics are the best two teams in it. And then I think there's a cluster of teams below that are really good. But there's no prime Golden State Warriors here, which to me ramps up the urgency that, hey, there is something to get this year, and it is very gettable.
Yeah, it does kind of feel like the Bucks and the Celtics are on this collision course, right? They, came out of the gate as the two best teams in the league by a pretty significant margin. And with the season that Tatum's having for Boston, that Giannis is having for Milwaukee, both of those players are certainly going to be in the MVP conversation for the rest of the season here. But you're right. I think there is a drop off after that. Within the Eastern Conference, I think a lot of people were talking about, would Philadelphia be in the mix there? Miami was high. Were they the number one seed last year? I don't even remember now.
I think so. Yeah.
But it seems like there's a pretty significant drop off. I do like Cleveland a lot, but it seems like they're maybe a year away. They seem to, I really like the Donovan Mitchell addition in their backcourt. Evan Mobley's a great young player in the front court, but it seems like they're short a wing if they're really going to compete this season. Like a 3-and-D wing type of player, I think they could really benefit from. So I think after that, there's a drop off. You have the Atlantas and the Torontos of the world, who are in a very different class from the Bucks and the Celtics. And then, like you said, out west, it's different this year as well. We just saw the Phoenix Suns just get smacked by Boston last night. And, even as good as the Suns are and as good as Devin Booker has been at points of this season, like, I don't know if people are really going to trust them in the postseason the way that, that they may have been more optimistic about when they were way ahead of the league last year and before that Dallas series. So it's hard to say. It's not a season with the Western Conference is as strong as always, but no overwhelming favorite to come out of that conference to challenge a Bucks or a Celtics, come June. But hard to say.
Yeah, Pelicans number one seed in the West. I'm sure we all saw that coming at the start of the season. But we've spoken more broadly about the Bucks so far in this podcast. But now I want to drill down a little bit more into the Giannis individual stuff, and particularly when it comes to MVPs, and then just the idea of being a Bucks fan in this era and understanding that at some point this is going to come to an end, and where that sits in the urgency for the fans with this team. But we discussed the Celtics. We discussed the Milwaukee Bucks. And if you go to betonline.net right now, you'll see that they are the two favorites for the NBA title. And they're in the same conference, which isn't always fun. You want the best teams to be separated until the NBA Finals. You want that path through to the NBA Finals if possible. But it might not be the case for the Bucks this season. And then when it comes to the MVP, Giannis is right up there. So is Jason Tatum. But you can get all those odds at betonline.net, which remains the number one place to get odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. And they're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. That's BetOnline, where the game starts. Giannis has 2 MVPs in the bank, Dan. And I think, as I mentioned at the top, certainly from a numbers point of view, 30-plus points. He's grabbing his rebounds. He's dishing his assists. Numbers-wise, and certainly per minute scoring-wise, he's number one in the league, I believe. So the Bucks are 18-6. So Giannis probably should be absolutely near the pointy end of the MVP odds, and he is. But yet there are Bucks fans, and they're in the YouTube comments every day, and they're furious. They're like, why are we talking about Jason Tatum? Why are we talking about Luka Doncic? And a lot of the time it comes back to legacy for Giannis. And they want him to get the 3rd MVP, and they want him to get the 4th MVP. I hope he gets it. Really want him to win the MVP. But I'm always just like, I want the title more than the MVP. I want the finals MVP more than the regular season MVP. We've seen it. I hope he gets 3. I hope he gets 4. But how much emphasis do we put on that award in the modern era? Understanding that there are different factors that go into it, the voting, the narrative, the storyline, all those types of things. Is that something that you really care about? Or how do you view where the MVPs are going to place him in the history of the game?
Yeah, I don't think it's the MVPs that is the main thing for figuring out his place in NBA history. I think it's going to be the championships, the finals MVPs over the regular season MVPs. And I think, like we mentioned, he has a chance to get another one of those this year with the team that the Bucks have. But one of the things that I did in this piece was really kind of take a look at Giannis's place in NBA history in those all-time rankings to try to get a sense of where that legacy is and what exactly the type of legacy he's chasing is. So I took a look at last year's, top 75 rankings that a number of people did for the NBA's celebration of its 75th season. And Giannis was in the top 25 in most of those rankings. So I took a look at ESPN, had him at 18th all time, and The Athletic had him at 24th. And
come on, Eric. Far out, Eric. I mean, fair income. You reckon Eric's got any? If you wanted to know whether he's got any pull at The Athletic, that's proven that he doesn't.
That's true. We got to get after Eric. He really does not write about Giannis enough, and really
that's right.
doesn't have enough to say about Giannis over at The Athletic. We got to get him to really champion his guy a little bit more, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so basically the placement centered around where Giannis ranked among some of the all-time great power forwards in NBA history. It was, I think in The Athletic had him behind the group of Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, Kevin Garnett, and Dirk Nowitzki. And I think ESPN had him at 18th. I think the only one of that group that Giannis was behind was Nowitzki. And so I think fair to suggest, given Giannis's age, that he's probably going to be passing that group, right? So that would put him, pretty firmly into the top 20 of all time. You look at some of the other big men at that tier in those rankings, talking about guys like David Robinson and Moses Malone, both guys who have won MVPs and won championships. I think it's pretty fair to suggest that Giannis is going to pass those guys. Actually, Moses Malone has a pretty, interesting resume comparable to Giannis as well. He won the MVP 3 times and won one championship with Philadelphia in 1983. David Robinson, he's one of the rankings already had Giannis ahead. ESPN already has Giannis ahead of David Robinson. So I think it's pretty fair to suggest they'll be past that group. And once you get past that group, you're talking about some of the best big men in NBA history, which gets us back to Tim Duncan, I think is right in that group. And also Shaquille O'Neal and Hakeem Olajuwon, all guys with multiple championships. So I think, to get to be part of that group, Giannis is probably going to have to win another championship.
And I think this comes back to the idea of caring about the Bucks, so being a Bucks fan and wanting him to, you talk about just entering his prime, but wanting him to finish this contract and sign another contract, another 5 years, whatever it may be in Milwaukee. And then you're talking about whatever happens after that. You hope he plays for Milwaukee forever, but if he did sign another 5-year contract, I mean, that's taking him to what, like 13, 14 seasons in Milwaukee. Hopefully another couple of championships. I mean, obviously his legacy and these titles that he can collect is going to count no matter where he gets them done. But we're a little bit selfish here. We want it to happen in Milwaukee, and we want it to happen with this franchise. So that's where someone like Shaq is interesting, did it with a couple of teams. Tim Duncan obviously is a little different because he did them all with the San Antonio Spurs. But I think that's where it's interesting to gauge the Bucks fan mindset, because clearly there are a lot of new Bucks fans that came because of Giannis, a lot of international fans that have come because of Giannis. But where do you sit as someone that has been through all the shitty days? I haven't watched through them all as long as you, but certainly well over a decade of bad basketball from this team and not missing a game. So I kind of look at it, and I just, the one championship, you never forget. That'll be something you'll have forever. But as I mentioned earlier, you do get a little bit hungry. But I also have in the back of my mind the idea that it's not going to last forever. And I don't want to be watching this team and getting angry about the missed opportunities and just purely thinking about Giannis's legacy, because I want to enjoy these years while we've got them, because the reality is we don't know how long it's going to last.
Yeah, I do think there is a sense there that, like, Giannis winning a championship in Milwaukee is a bigger deal than most championships, right? Oh. The Bucks were so bad for so long, and the Milwaukee is, one of the 5 smallest markets in the league. So I think winning here, the way that he did with the 50-point closeout game, with the way that series unfolded against Phoenix, probably the greatest individual finals performance for anyone since Michael Jordan. I think that is going to raise him up a level, just how that title happened, with everything that went into it, coming out of the pandemic and out of the bubble, and having, 100,000 people in the Deer District celebrating that championship. So it is such a special, unique title that I think it is going to stand out in ways that, maybe like Shaq winning with the Heat might not, So I think that is a quality that is going to work in his favor and his legacy as well. But you're right. You have to savor all of these Giannis moments while it's happening, because we spent 30 years. I'm a lifelong Bucks fan. Spent 30 years watching this team lose before we finally broke through and started seeing real seeing the title window open. With Giannis, and you just have to savor these moments while you can. You never know if we're ever going to experience anything like this again. So that's why I try to watch every Giannis game and just savor this guy's career as much as I can, and watch these games while I can, because you never know if anything like this, as a sports fan, not just a Bucks fan, but just as a sports fan, is ever anything like this will ever happen again.
Yeah, and I get caught up in it myself, and people listen to this podcast every day. The crazy people, the sickos that listen to this podcast every day, they hear us always talking big picture, talking about the postseason, what it matters. And it's like, sometimes you just got to sit back and say, hey, we all get to sit down on the couch or go to the arena, put our feet up, relax, and every single night you go to the basketball, you expect this team is going to win. That's not normal, and we've been doing that for 5 years, and it's because sometimes you put the pressure on the end result, but overall, the journey to get there is pretty damn entertaining as well. I want to remind everyone to make sure you listen to the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Where do you think the ceiling is? One last one for you, Dan. We actually got 2 last ones for you, but where do you think the ceiling is if we do move aside from the franchise goals? And it's all intertwined, I understand that, but in terms of his ceiling for the overall rankings, I think you have to be sitting with the trajectory that he's on, that top 10 is clearly within reach. And there are people out there that will take it even further and say top 5, top 3, GOAT conversation. Where do you sort of sit as you've put this story together and thought about the big picture stuff?
So it's interesting. I think there was a question in the post-game press conference last night that one of the reporters asked Giannis about that. He asked him about, his potential to be, kind of in the GOAT conversation. There's no ceiling with this guy. I'm ready to believe anything's possible with Giannis.
Yeah.
I think, he's only 28 and he's already accomplished so much. And he still is getting better. That's the crazy thing about him. I do feel like watching him night in, night out, there's parts of his game he's continuing to improve on. Now, maybe the free throw shooting's down a little bit this year than years past, but I think there's still parts of his game that he's getting better and better on. The creativity and his finishing in the lane is just remarkable this year. The way he can spin that ball and get it in and, finish through contact and do so many of the different things that he does. That little baseline fadeaway jumper seems to be getting better and better for him. Some of the mid-range game things. So I think, and he's also just year in and year out, one of the best defensive players in the league too. And I don't see that type of thing slowing down anytime soon. So I think he has a chance to be really one of these all-time greats, to be a top 5 player in NBA history. I think it's out there for him. There's no ceiling when it comes to Giannis. I'm ready to believe anything. I watched him score 50 points to close out a finals game. I'm ready to believe anything with Giannis.
I agree with you. And perhaps he has the most important trait that the absolute best of the best that have ever done it have had before, in that he is a complete psychopath when it comes to getting better every single day and looking after his body. He does everything the right way. And that is the biggest reason why that he's just going to continue to get better. And we're fortunate enough that we get to watch it on a nightly basis. Last one before we go. And this, whatever you say to this, is not going to impact whether you come back on this podcast. But Joe Ingles was with the Wisconsin Herd today, which means that he is getting closer and closer to a return. We know assistant coach Mike Dunlap just had the little cryptic tweet. Maybe there's a Christmas surprise coming up. It's December 9 here in Australia, December 8 for you, Dan. So that's still 2.5 weeks until Christmas. I think, and we mentioned why it was a little bit delayed for Chris, obviously with the family circumstances there, but generally we look at it and say, okay, if you're getting assigned to the Herd, 2 to 3 weeks seems like a reasonable window. But big picture, are you a Joe Ingles believer for this version of the Milwaukee Bucks?
I am. And I can't believe we've made it all the way, about a half hour into this podcast before you mentioning Joe Ingles. That has to be a Kane Pittman Locked on Bucks record.
I agree. It's all about Giannis today, Dan.
That's right. I'm pretty optimistic about him as that type of offensive creator, scorer off the bench that can really juice this team in second units. I think we've talked, there's been so much talk over the course of the year about potential upgrades to the roster here and there. And I think Ingles is going to be the type of midseason upgrade to the roster that is the type of thing that you want for a team like the Bucks. And especially the type of role that he can play. I think you've talked about this so much in the show, but I think adding an offensive threat to this team is really what you need, because they're so good defensively. I think if not number one, still one of the top teams in the league defensively. I think their challenge is going to be finding a little bit more offense. And I think Joe Ingles, I'm a believer that he's going to be a guy who's going to be able to provide that.
Well, we absolutely love to hear that. And I thought you might say that. So that's why I asked you that question. It was an absolute setup. But one thing I do love is I tweeted a little update, as you do for the Australian fans waking up over here. The news was old news for everyone that's living in the US by that point. And just a little explainer, for perhaps some people here in Australia that aren't in tune with, is he playing for the G League, all those types of things. And the thing that I always love is you get a number of people that'll comment or send you a DM or whatever, and they'll be like, congratulations. It's like, well, I'm not friends with Joe. Like, you don't need to congratulate me for him returning. Congratulate Joe because he's coming back from the ACL. But I appreciate it. People are nice. People are nice to me, Dan, when it comes to the Bucks. That's the main thing.
That's a good thing, right? People are, the internet can be a scary place, as I know from covering politics in the state of Wisconsin. So, I'm probably one of the only people out there who will write a Bucks column and get a stick to politics tweet maybe in coming back. So I get some people who follow me just from my political news and analysis and reporting and all that, who will be like, what is this guy talking about with the Bucks? Stick to politics. I'm probably one of the very few people who ever gets that one.
You can do both, Dan. And
Right.
I'm looking forward to flying back into Milwaukee sometime soon, going through the recombobulation area, and then catching up with you at a bar somewhere and chucking down a few beers, man, because it's been far too long. It's always good to catch up with you. And I don't know, do you want to plug one more time? Do you want to get a plug out there so people can subscribe and do what they need to do?
Yeah, the recombobulation area on Substack. We're a growing local publication. Come find us, come subscribe. Dan, you're the best, and everyone make sure you read this story as well and share it and do all those cool things. It's one of the great conversations that, to be honest, I didn't think we would ever have about one of the players playing for the Milwaukee Bucks. So it's pretty cool to talk about a generational superstar. Dan, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Kane.